Parashas Pinchas describes the korbanos, particularly communal korbanos that were brought in the Beis Hamikdash, including the 70 bulls that were brought over the course of Sukkot, which Rashi tells us correspond to the 70 nations. And then he tells us they're in a declining number to indicate that the nations of the world will decline. Now, the way that Rashi says it and where he says it does seem a little bit misplaced. And so it turns out that actually Rashi is telling us something more than what meets the eye. Even Pasuk, commenting on the Pasuk that says, about the mincha and the nesachim that had to accompany the bulls that were brought on Sukkot, and specifically on the second day of Sukkot, that's where Rashi tells us, there are 70 bulls that are brought through the course of Sukkot. Why? Corresponding to the 70 nations of the world that will decline and disappear over the course of time. It's an indication that they will disappear. Over Beis Hamikdash, but in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, when they brought korbanos, that protected them from suffering. So, at face value, it would appear that what's bothering Rashi is by Rashi Kosher. It would seem that what's bothering Rashi is the fact that it's unusual for korbanos to be in a reducing number. So why? On a fanfare to which he explains, that the reason we have korbanos that reduce in number over the course of a week is because these particular korbanos represent the 70 nations whose destiny is that they will decline over the course of time. And if you're going with that perspective, then it's logical why Rashi only addresses this issue on the second day of Sukkot, rather than the first day. Logically, because what's bothering Rashi in the pasuk, which is what prompts Rashi to say that the bulls on Sukkot are supposed to represent the nations. When do you notice the reduction in numbers? Only on the second day. That's when you see that we've reduced the number of bulls by one from the first day. So that's when the question arises. That's when Rashi addresses it. And that would seem to be a simple explanation. Rashi is bothered by the declining number of korbanos, which seems an unusual thing, because generally it's Mailim Bakodesh. However, what's really strange is where Rashi says it. The minimum from Pinchas and Vahilchins that men gleich in dem ersten Pasuk von die Gebane shel Yom HaSheni. We are alerted to the fact that the amount of bulls has reduced in the first pasuk that describes the korbanos on the second day. We see that we've gone from 13 to 12 bulls. One less than the preceding day. Why doesn't Rashi address the issue when it appears, when the number of parim reduces? Why does he wait until the next pasuk when he's commenting not on the number of bulls, but rather the accessories that came with the bulls as part of the korban? In them is not gresen. What makes it an even greater question is in them pasuk that pasuk doesn't say anything about the number of bulls, which surely is the big catalyst for Rashi's commentary. So why say it here and not where it's much more obvious in the first time that we notice a decline in the numbers? Okay, that's our first major question. And Rashi's own explanation also raises questions. Because if you've paid attention to what Rashi says, it actually seems self-contradictory. Why? Because I hope on sein Pirush Zagendig, as das was die Pareachog seinen Keneged die Shivim Umois, he starts it by saying that the bulls over the course of Sukkot represent the nations of the world. Why? Is in Anoifim Fulmi Smarten Vahilchim? Why is it that they reduce in number? Because Simen Keloya Lahem, because it's an indication that those nations will eventually disappear. And then immediately says the exact opposite. As Beis Hamikdash, the korbanos that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, not only did the korbanos not cause these nations to be eliminated, now to the contrary, it protected them. So which one is it? Is the korban a sign of the decline of the nations or a protection of the nations? In other words, that prevents their decline. And you might want to say, well, we're talking about two different actions that are related to two different things. In other words, it's only the number of bulls that indicates the reduction and disappearance of these nations. But actually bringing the korbanos protects them. Maybe. It's still, there are other questions to raise. Number one, here it's explaining the pasuk. And apparently the question in the pasuk is, why are they reducing numbers of bulls? Why is it relevant over here to say the karbonos protect them? Beis Veker. And the other big question is, whichever way you look at it, it's a self-contradictory message. How is it possible that the same karbonos should have two contradictory elements associated with it? Simen Kiloya, on the one hand, these are karbonos that represent the destruction of those nations, and they're karbonos that protect those nations. Which is it? Now, before we can answer that, there's a whole string of details within Rashi's language that we have to explore as well. There's a whole lot of nuance, 5 things we're going to pick up in Rashi's language. Number 1, Aleph. We've come from the position that Rashi is addressing the question, why are the bulls over the course of Sukkot reducing in number? So if that's what he's addressing, Piroshe, that's what he should have started to explain. La porim, he should have said straight away for the bulls, that represents the nations who decline and eventually disappear. And then after that, he could have brought some kind of a proof. That's why there are 70 bulls to represent the 70 nations. But first give the main message, which is declining numbers to represent declining nations. Why does Rashi first explain why there are 70 bulls in total and that they represent the 70 nations? And then get to the point, which is what drew our attention to this in the first place, that they're reducing in number. Furthermore, in the next part of what Rashi is going to explain, where he talks about the nesachim, etc., that had to be brought for the sheep, there Rashi does do what we'd expect. He tells us it's keneged yisrovahem kevoim, that the number of sheep does not change because it refers to the Jewish people who don't change. They're established. Which is different to the bulls that reduce in number, representing nations who decline. And then he explains why the total number of sheep is 98 to correspond to neutralizing the curses of Parshas Kisavai, as we'll see later in the Sikha. So why does Rashi come from a different approach when he's describing the Parei Hechag, which represent the nations? Number 2, Beis. Why does Rashi have to add so many words? It represents the nations who decline. And it's a sign that they will disappear. Surely it would have been sufficient just to say 70 bulls in total in declining number to represent nations who decline. Because this would actually match an expression that Rashi used previously in Pashas Lechacha, with the Bris Ben Absarim, where it says that where it speaks about the animals that were split, that indicates the nations of the world who will eventually disappear. Number 3, Gimel. It seems that Rashi is missing the main point of what he wants to convey. What protects the nations in the time of the Beis Hamikdash? The karbonos that represent them, that are brought on their behalf. Rashi doesn't even say that. He should have said not in the time of the Beis Hamikdash they're protected. He should have said these karbonos protect them. Fourth. Why does Rashi in fact say in the time of the Beis Hamikdash they'll be protected? Did anybody suppose that you bring karbonos not in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore there'd be protection through the karbonos not during the time of the Beis Hamikdash? Why does Rashi have to tell it us? And lastly, Rashi in Gemara Zokt, Rashi in the Gemara Sukkah says, that the 70 bulls over the course of Sukkot, which represent the 70 nations, is there to atone for them, that there should be rain throughout the world, because Sukkot is when the Eibusha judges what rainfall there will be during the course of the year. So, and under how come in Gemara versus in Chumash, Rashi gives different explanations of what these karbonos did for the nations of the world? Because here he says, we protected them from suffering. Why doesn't he say the same thing as in the Gemara, or in the Gemara the same as over here? So the explanation of all of these questions is as follows. The very fact that the bulls, through the course of Sukkot, reduce in number from day to day, is actually not such a big question. Because even a child learning Chumash for the first time can imagine that every number, particularly numbers of karbonis recorded in the Torah, obviously alludes to something. He's already seen this before. Again, back in Parshas Lech Lecha in the Bris Ben Abesarim, Eglo Mishu Leshes Goimer. Valderch in Parshas Noseh Badi Karbonos and Nesim. He's learned that the various numbers that Avraham Avinu had to bring 3 calves, or a calf that's a 3-year-old, and the Nesim had to bring their specific karbonos. So he knows the numbers represent things, but I don't have to know what those things are necessarily in Pshat. As jeden Tag von Sukkot ist da etwas verbunden mit dem betreffenden Mispah Dafka von die Purim. So the child could say very simply, on the first day of Sukkot, there is a symbolism to 13 bulls. And on the second day of Sukkot, 12 bulls, etc. I don't have to know what the symbolism is. I just have to know the symbolism exists. Rashi doesn't have to unpack what each number symbolizes. Because that's not relevant to the pshat, simple understanding of the pasuk. Something you explore further when you learn medrash or whatever other insights you learn. And the Ben Chomesh Mikra Veis, as in Teres Faranito pshat no remes udrush, the child knows that there are multiple levels to Torah. So that's why he's not bothered by the fact that there are different numbers of the karbonos, because it will be dealt with. One day when I'm a little bit older, I'll learn the medrash or whatever, and it will give me an answer. From Pshat, the child is satisfied with the fact that I'm at the stage that we're just learning the simple understanding of the Psukim. And the only time we're going to explore things that are more nuanced or more alluded to rather than simple and face value is if there's something in the Pshat that will not make sense without that information. So therefore the child is not bothered at all by the fact that the numbers change. He says, one day I'll learn what that means. But then he gets to the part of the pasuk that says, 1 second, there are fixed accessories brought with the karbonos, the menachos, the nesachim, and they are b'misparim kamishpat. They have to match the numbers as mandated. Oh, dort nicht verstandig. Then he has a question. If it's true, as I thought, that the special number of karbonos per day of Sukkot, each represents something, it alludes to something, then that implies that each carbon is independent and unique from every other carbon. So if each day is a different kind of carbon, represented by the fact that there's a different number of animals, then the pasuk should have detailed each day what the karbanos are. On day 1, he has all the information, including the menachos, including the nisachim. In other words, don't only tell me the different numbers of the bulls, tell me all the numbers, the bulls, the sheep, the menachos, the nisachim, etc. We have precedent for this. When the Nasim inducted the Mizbeach, even though they brought identical sacrifices, they all brought the identical amount of animals, the identical animals. But because, as the Medrash tells us, each Nasi brought their specific carbon, although identical in presentation, with a different, unique intention. Each one focused their intention with the appropriate kavanas that was suited to their particular shevet, to their tribe. Therefore, therefore the Torah lists again and again by every Nasi, 12 times over, the alle protea karbonis, all of the details of every single animal that was brought in the carbon. It doesn't just say, and he brought the same as him, or something like that. But here when it comes to the karbonis of Sukkot, Protei HaKorban, the Torah does not reiterate each day what exactly constituted the menachos that had to accompany the korban. Neither but the pasuk it mazgit. To the contrary, the pasuk emphasizes the uniformity of those menachos. Umin chasam and of an iskayim. B'misparim kamishpat. In other words, das sind demselben Mishpat wie die Korbanos von Esh and Tog. In other words, the Torah is highlighting for us that the mincha that accompanies the korban every day and the nesachim that accompany the korban every day are identical to day one. Das heißt, that implies, nicht nur ist da nicht mutgisch wie die Korbanos für jeden Tag seine verschiedene Korbanos. Not only is the Torah not emphasizing, like by the Nesim, that each day was actually a different korban, now verkehrt, it's doing the opposite. Der Pasuk ist madgish, as es seien derselbe Inyan, was chaz sich hier b'chol yom kemishpat von Esh and Tog. It's the same process that's recurring day after day. If it's the same process, wird der Rebbe schwer bei Rashi, and that's when you have a big question. If it's the same process from day to day, v'bal die Korbanos echag seien in Inyan, which implies that all of the Korbanos of Sukkot all are the same principle, the same idea, the same theme, then why is one animal within that system, the bull, reducing from day to day? If it was changing the number of bulls in a way that indicates bracha and increasing, fine, good, we'd appreciate it. But why are we reducing a number which is against the theme of how Judaism typically operates? So that's why Rashi has his question at that point. Now I realize these korbanos are all meant to be the same, yet they're not the same, and they're in a declining fashion. Plus, there's a self-contradictory aspect to this. Von dem, was jeden Tag ist erschienen mit dem Misbar Kapone Zetmen, als seinen verschieden mit anderen Remosim. The fact that every day is a different amount of bulls as part of the korban package, that indicates that every single day actually has a different intention. And then straight after that, the Torah emphasizes that they're one concept. That doesn't add up. If they're meant for Rashi, so Rashi says, because you have to understand what the unique message of these particular bulls are. There is a total of 70 bulls brought across the week of Sukkot to correspond to the 70 nations that decline. That's why he starts first by telling us the overall number, because it's one theme right throughout the whole week of Sukkot. What is the theme? The theme is represented by the overall total number of bulls, which is 70, that represents the theme that these are korbanos for the 70 nations. Die Purim von alle 7 Tag stellen zusammen ein Inyan over made ein Mishpat. All the korbanos of all 7 days comprise a single message, a single theme, and therefore a single law, which is Shivim Momos representing the 70 nations. And that is the reason itself why the numbers decline. Und aus Gufe ist der Tam, because the theme of this week is the nations of the world, that's why the numbers of bulls declines, because what it's supposed to represent, the nations of the world, is an entity that declines. Now, beim Chumash Lemikre is aber nicht verstandig, but the young child learning Chumash for the first time will still have a question, which is, we have learned many details about korbanos throughout the Chumash. Allerlei korbanos. And the theme consistently throughout korbanos is they have a positive impact. What's going on over here? They atone. They give their b'shtenachas. So the child's wondering, how is it possible? Now suddenly you have a korban which is the opposite of the theme of every other korban around. This is a korban which is the theme of destruction. Therefore Rashi has to explain, it's not that the korbanos chas v'shalom are the cause of destruction, but simin kiloya lahem, the number of these korbanos indicate the natural destruction or disappearance of those nations. That creates protection against that natural entropy. The fact that the korbanos represent nations who decline doesn't mean that that's the purpose or the goal or the impact of the korban. No, it's just an indication of how their lives work. It's a number or a style of numbers that illustrate who we are representing. Who are we representing? Nations who decline. But the power of the carbon is actually to undo that natural entropy. Die Piole von die Carbonis, was das ist Beis Hamikdash, ist verkehrt zu auftan a Hagona. Exactly, young Ben Chomish Lemikra, what you believe about Carbonis, that they always bring something positive to the table. Here too, they bring protection to those nations who are originally on their way to decline. Und die Piule von der Akrove ist doch, wenn nicht noch bis man Akrove. And Rashi says an interesting perspective. Not only at the time the carbon is brought does it protect those nations, no bizman akrava haba, but from one sukkah until we bring those carbonas in the next sukkah. And that's why he uses the words Beis Hamikdash, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. They have this overarching protection thanks to those carbonas that were brought on their behalf. Und der Tama Adgosha Beis Hamikdash chulei. That's why Rashi emphasizes in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, weil damit wird klar als dafke der Inyan Meginim Aleim ist verbunden mit Piulas HaKarben Beis Hamikdash. What Rashi is doing for us is telling us the impact of the carbon is that throughout the period that the carbon is available, which means there's a Beis Hamikdash, that's when they have absolute protection. Mashenkein, the simen keloyalahem, whereas the indicator of their destruction, was steht fadem in Rashi, which Rashi already mentioned, is asimavach is verbunden mit die Umas in allgemein nicht mit Yemei Hamikdash. It's not something the Beis Hamikdash does to the nations of the world. It is the overarching reality of those nations. That's how they are. They are a declining entity. Apihanal ober bat. As the inyan from mismatim v'holchim is nipiulas hakarbon ablei simen kloyilohem. Now that we have illustrated clearly, it's not chas v'shalom that the carbonos cause the decline of the nations. Rather, the carbonos, in identifying the nations, identifies that there are nations who decline. Konteis, die zwei inyanim b'aponim v'chazanim keneged di umois. So now what emerges is the two things mentioned in the Torah or alluded to in the Torah to represent in these carbonas the nations of the world. Aleph, the mispar kel shivim. Firstly, that there's a grand total of 70 bulls to represent the grand total of 70 nations. And Beis, die Akroves and Anöfen von Mismatim v'Hilchim haben zwischen sich kein Scheiches nicht. And then we're saying the fact that the number of carbonas declines, that seems to be completely different. In other words, we're showing a message or illustrating a message that these carbonas represent the 70 nations in total. And then we're saying, and the way that the number is structured in the course of the week, that illustrates the decline of the nations across the span of history. What's the link? Rashi should have actually split it into two separate messages. Shivim keneged shivim momois. He should have told us that there would be a total of 70 bulls to correspond to the 70 nations. And then, a zweiter inyan, maybe even a different divra maschil, and then he should have told us independently the fact that the way those 70 bulls are brought is in reducing number. That represents something else about the nations of the world, that they decline. Why did he put them all into the same pirush? And the other thing that's strange is, why in fact does Rashi have to bring two links between the carbonos, or why does the pasuk have to bring two links between the carbonos and the nations of the world? 70 to represent their number, and reducing numbers to represent their decline. So therefore we have to conclude it's not as simple as we originally said, which is that the number 70 only represents their natural behavior or their natural destiny. But rather, that decline of the nations of the world is somehow linked to bringing the carbonos as well. And we'll listen to Rashi's expression, and we'll see why and how Rashi explains this to us, and also why Rashi said it differently to how he explains things in the Gemara in Sukkah. Therefore, Rashi says specifically that these carbonos protected the nations from suffering. Not like he says in the Gemara that these carbonos brought them some kind of atonement and therefore they deserved rain and whatever other brachas. Part of the impact of the carbon is what? As nit kukendig der Uf, was der Eberstadt melchatchile gemacht die Umois in an Eifan ze sollen sein mismatem behuchen. Regardless of the fact that the way they just set up the world is that these nations are destined to decline. Is Beis Hamikdash, but there's a hiatus, or there's maybe not a hiatus, but there's a unique intervention during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, which is when Eden have makriv given pareachog, when the Eden brought these bulls over Sukkos, uvedafka shivim keneged shivim umois, and specifically they brought 70 of these bulls to correspond to those nations. Is alla ayin parim meginim aleim mina yisurim. Those korbanos created protection for these nations from suffering. Die Pareachag haben megen gewen auf die Ummes, als bei sie soll dem nicht sein kein ihnen von Mismatim, weil afinu nicht am Mismatim von Yisurim. So there is a pu'ula, there is an impact of the karbanos on them. So it's not a negative impact, it's a positive impact. What is the positive impact? That it prevents them from reduction, either reduction in number, or Pasha just having suffering and difficulties in their lives, which would, so to speak, wear them down. So that's Rashi's message over here, that there's something really powerful happening over in the Karbanos, that the Torah alerts us to when it tells us all the Karbanos carry a single theme. What's the single theme? That they represent the nations of the earth. Yet these are Karbanos that are in declining number because the destiny of those nations is to decline, but the power of the Karban that extends not only through the time that the Karbanos are being brought, but right across from the one sukkahs to the next, as long as the Beis Hamikdash is around, to protect them that they don't actually have their destiny play out in a painful way. And that gives us even better insight into what Rashi says about what the lambs represent. What do the lambs represent? He says, Yisrael, the lambs represent the Jewish people, Shenikru Sepazura, as they are called, the lost sheep, which is not a complimentary statement. But they don't shift in number because the Jewish people are firmly established as an entity that doesn't disappear or decline. And Rashi tells us, in total there have been 98 of those lambs through the course of Sukkot. The objective of which is that they neutralize the threat of the 98 so-called curses that are recorded in Parshas Kisaveh. That explanation that Rashi is giving us also doesn't seem to make sense. We definitely understand why Rashi is saying the lambs represent the Jewish people and the Jewish people are stable. That's to create contrast between how the Jewish experience is versus the experience of the other nations. Because the Parei Hechag, which represent the other nations, as we've already illustrated, they decline. But what prompts Rashi, if he's trying to explain the Pshat, to give us a symbolism of the number 98? As we said earlier in the Sikha, there are many times the Karbanos are presented in particular numbers where we know that there obviously is something alluded to in those numbers, and we don't have to know what that information is right here and not right now. We understand why Rashi would look at the number of bulls to prove to us that the bulls represent the nations of the world, because 70 bulls, 70 nations. But what is there about the number 98 that is so important for us understanding the link between the lambs and the Jewish people? Not the beer in them is, but going on the back of what we learned about how Rashi says the Karbanos protected the nations of the world. So what did we say? We already established that all 70 bulls brought across the whole 7 days of Sukkot are a single theme, the theme of representing the nations. So it follows logically that in the same way as those 70 bulls representing the nations carries a singular theme of their decline and the Karbanos protect them, it follows logically that the symbolism for the Jewish people, the lambs, should also constitute a specific theme. And seeing as those lambs are brought as offerings alongside the bulls, there must be a similar impact that both of them are having on their respective constituents. So Zok Rashi. That's what Rashi tells us. There are 98 kavasim. Why? To neutralize the 98 curses of Parshas Kisaveh. Yes, it's 100% true that fundamentally what lambs represent, and they don't change in number, is the Jewish people who are stable and don't decline. The primary message is the Jewish people do not, God forbid, decline. We are stable and we're eternal. Aber das noch nicht schön, bei sein Yisurim Rachmana litzlan. That doesn't mean that we're going to have it easy. That doesn't exclude the possibility of difficulties. If them kommen die Kvasim. That's why Rashi tells us these lambs not only represent who we are and the fact that we're eternal, but to well, there's a match. When we spoke about the Purim, we said the Purim are an indication of the end of these nations. When we talk about the Kvasim, we said the Kvasim are an indication of the end of the curses. As nicht nur, was die Etzem von Eden bleibt ganz. So the message over here is not just that Jews endure, not das an von menucha v'shalva on Yisurim, but we endure in a sense of peace and serenity without having tzoros. Now, we darf noch verstehen, but there's still something else to understand, which is there's another species of animal in there. In Pasuk steht doch la porim lo elim, the rams v'la kvosim. How come Rashi jumps to the conclusion that Kevasim represent the Jewish people when there was the word Elim before that? And don't try and answer this by saying, as das ist der Fall, was ihnen werden angerufen, se, aber nicht Elim. Because the pasuk says se pezura Yisrael, and we don't have a pasuk that says that the Jewish people are a ram. And maybe you'll even say that in Parshas Lech Lecha, in the Bris Ben Abasarim, Rashi actually made the rams an allusion to the nations of the world. So maybe that's why he doesn't say Elim refers to the Jewish people. It's not that simple. First of all, we're in the Karbonos of Sukkot, which means we're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the Karbonos of Shmini Atzeres. And what does it say there? Par echad, ayel echad. It says a single bull and a single ram. Vashteit Shmini Atzeres. Rashi says both of those animals represent the Jewish people, so there is precedent that the rams could represent the Jewish people. That there are ways to link both a bull and a ram to the Jewish people, whether it's because of the number or whatever else they represent. Surely Rashi could have found some kind of an indication of why there are 14 rams over the course of Sukkot and how that represents the Jewish people, but he doesn't. He skips right over the rams and he goes to the lambs. Why? Second of all, Beis, even if you're going to really force the issue, that there is nothing that suits the pshat that would align the 14 rams for the Jewish people. And that's why Rashi has no choice but to say that the lambs are the representation of the Jewish people. Let's even assume that to be true. The pasuk then doesn't make sense. Halamai is the Torah mafsik division diporim keneged ha'umois unkevasim keneged Yisrael mit Edom. Surely the pasuk is making a contrast over here between the nations of the world represented by bulls, the nation of Israel represented by lambs. They should have been next to each other. Why stick the Elim that don't seem to symbolize any of the nations in between? To understand that, let's first remember was Rashi is meforish as the porim seine keneged die umas belois mitzadem misbar hakel shivim. Let's remind ourselves that when Rashi linked the Purim to the nations of the world, he first pointed out the number. That's the link. 70 bulls, 70 nations. Rashi is talking about Parshas Lech Lecha. Again, if you go back to the Bris Ben Abasarim, as umois nimshel Purim shenema sivavuni Purim Rabbi. There Rashi said the reason the nations are compared to bulls because the pasuk in Tehillim that says, I was surrounded by many bulls, implying almost an aggression. Why here does Rashi not quote that? And he only says it's because the number 70, that's the link between the Purim. And remember, Rashi typically either refers back to information he's already given us or reminds us of that information. To me, it's not gresser to make the question stronger. Rashi gives a reason why lambs represent the Jewish people. Right? In other words, that it's not a numbers thing. There's something about the nature of a lamb that talks to what the Jewish people are like. Rashi should have illustrated something about the nature of what a bull is and represents, and therefore it's the symbol of the nations of the world, not just because there happen to be 70 of them. So the explanation, which we'll have to find, not using pshat, but using a little bit of remes, and we'll pick it out of the karbanos on Pesach. But the karbanos v'chag Pesach is Rashi meforish. When we describe the karbanos of Pesach, Rashi says as follows: Parim keneged Avram. The bulls that were brought on Pesach represent Avram Avinu. Elim keneged Eloi shel Yitzchak. The rams represent the ram that replaced Yitzchak at the Akedah. Kibosim keneged Yaakov, and the sheep represent Yaakov. So Favor zogt Rashi Elim. How come over there Rashi takes rams, Lashon Rabim in the plural? If the pasuk is talking about a single ram, as the meat Rashi is illustrating to us as the Pirs Batzitzach nit nor zu dem pasuk. Rashi is saying elim in the plural because he wants to draw our attention that his explanation is not only relevant to that context, which is the karbanos of Pesach, not to alle karbanos musfeyamtiv from Purim elim ukvasim, but rather he's expanding his message out to be relevant to every karban musaf on all the three yomim tovim, or every yom tov. As Zani connected that every yom tov where we have bulls and rams and sheep, it's always to represent Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Und erfahr, Kerash nicht sagen, as die Pare Achag Zani connected umas nimshlo the Purim. That's how Rashi can't tell us that the reason that the nations are compared to bulls is because of the intrinsic nature of a bull, because Valadrab. The main Purim does Haremasef Avram, because Rashi's already told us that bulls on Yom Tov represent Avram Avinu. Remember, because he prepared the calves for the Malachim. This is not the Misper Purim Zani connected Shivim Umas. The only thing that links the bulls to the nations is not the bulls but the numbers. So it's considering it, and that's not a contradiction. As the Purim said, Sai Keneged Avram and Sai Keneged Shivim Umo, is that the same symbol of oxen or bulls could both represent Avram Avinu and Lahavdil the nations. It's not a surprise. Because if Avram state, because the whole being of Avram, as his name indicates, is Av Hamoin Goyim Nesaticho, the father of many nations. Is member Chagasukas Makriv Diporim Kinegdi Umas of Avram is in Saticho to say Leov. So therefore, on Sukkot, we're bringing karbanos for those nations over whom Avram Avinu is supposed to be the ultimate father. So there's no contradiction that what represents the nations is linked to Avram Avinu. Likewise, when it comes to the sheep, as das was is connected Israel, the fact that sheep represent the Jewish people works perfectly with the fact that sheep represent Yaakov Avinu. Because only Yaakov Avinu had all of his children aligned with the value system that he believed. Von ihm seinen Aros blows Yisrael. He is the only one of the others whose all of his children are Jewish. Whereas Yitzchak had a rebel son, Esav, and of course Avraham Avinu had Yishmael. So now, first of all, that will help us understand why the pasuk between Parim, which represent the nations, and Kavasim, which represent the Jews, inserts Elim, which are related to Yitzchak. But not euch dem ta'am ashinoi, was dafka by karbonos echag hotman gebracht Elim shenayim. But not only will explain why the Elim, why the rams belong there, but also why there are two of them, unlike on Pesach when there's one. Or the other Yom Tovim, where you bring a single ram. We've already shown that on Pesach, the bulls don't just represent Avram Avinu, but rather Avram Avinu as the father of nations. And the sheep don't only represent Yaakov, but Yaakov is the father of the Jewish people. Now, there's got to be a similar theme about the rams that correspond to Yitzchak. That's why there are two rams to represent that there are two children which represent two nations that emerged from Yitzchak, Yaakov, and his nemesis Esav. And that is the order of how the karbanos are presented on Sukkot. First, we have the bulls to represent the broad humanity, all the 70 nations. And at the end, we bring the sheep to represent us. And what sits in the middle, almost as a bridge between them, you have two rams representing the two great nations of Esav, which in effect represents all the nations of the world, and Yaakov, of course, which is us, which is Israel. That's why Rashi doesn't have to give us any explanation for the significance of the total number of rams that are brought, 14 rams, because the rams are not there as an independent entity, there's a bridge between the two entities that do represent humanity, the Purim on the one hand and the Kvasim on the other. Now the only thing is that the way we've explained this is that the rams represent Yaakov and Esav, but Rashi says they represent the ram of Yitzchak. Rashi specifically says Edom is connected Eloi shel Yitzchak. The rams represent the ram of the Akedah. What's the link between, if the rams are supposed to represent Yaakov and Esav, what's the link specifically to the ram of the Akedah? Is the Birbad Zeh al derech haremes again looking beyond the Pshat? Here's the explanation. So it says in Pirkei Rabbi Elazar about this ram that replaced Yitzchak Avinu at the Akedah. Shtei karnov shel ayil, it had two horns. Shel smoil nishma koil al Har Sinai. The left one became the shofar that was blown at Har Sinai. V'keren sheyimin asid itkeb eli asid lavai. And the right horn, that's reserved for the time of Mashiach. What's the difference between Matan Torah and the time of Mashiach? The chilek between the zwei yonim Matan Torah, Har Sinai, uli asid lavai is, the difference is this. Matan Torah tashaychas se'idin dafka. Matan Torah is for the Jewish nation. Torah is merasha kilas Yaakov, on akim sheisuk b'Torah chayv misa. Torah is for the Yidden. And if an idolater engages in Torah, it's not a good thing. Whereas the divine revelations at the time of Mashiach in the Umas as will have a benefit and impact on the nations of the world, as predicted even before Yaakov and Esav were born, that Esav would be there to help to assist Yaakov. As the pasuk says, that others, foreigners, will come and they'll help us in the field, looking after our animals, etc., etc., so we can be freed up to learn Torah. And like the Navi Tzefania tells us, everybody's going to be converted to call out and daven today in a single voice. So therefore the two horns of that ram of Yitzchak, one of them is specifically related to the Jewish people, the one from Matan Torah. And the other is relevant to the entire humanity, including the nations of the world, which is the one of Mashiach. And now there's a richer insight from this as well. In terms of the impact of bringing those 70 bulls over the course of Sukkot on behalf of the nations of the world, Rashi told us specifically of the protection afforded by those karbonos lasted as long as the Beis Hamikdash lasted. Whereas when it comes to the lambs, to the sheep, he says, there are 98 of these sheep to remove the 98 curses. Now, when you examine what those curses are, many of them, many of them are specifically designed for when it's not the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So the bir in them says, the reason is because we now have davening, which takes the place of karbonos in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash. And das, was man vielleicht uftan, bis manche Beis Hamikdash kaim durch karbonos, tut man nicht auf durch tefillah. Whatever we required karbonos to achieve in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, we can still achieve now through prayer. The Chelek is but there's a difference. Durch karbonos begashmis in Beis Hamikdash al gashmi, when you actually brought a physical carbon in the physical Beis Hamikdash, kommt harab die piulas karbonos bis in gashmis soilam beolam bechitzenes bepeil mamash. Then the impact of those karbonos was to bring whatever spiritual energy it was into this world in a way that it impacted the physical world, as the Alter Rebbe says in the Torah, in the external physical world in a practical way. Tachlis. Whereas during davening, whatever the impact of the davening is typically something that affects us in a spiritual way and affects our neshamas. That's the difference between the impact of the bulls, which are karbanos, and the lambs, or the sheep, which are karbanos. The bulls, which are supposed to have an impact on the world, on the nations, can only have their impact if the Beis Hamikdash is standing. Because then you have physical karbanos, which, as the Alter Rebbe says, can touch the more extraneous parts of the world in which the nations live. But in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, that's gone. As the Gemara there in Sukkah tells us, woe to the nations who destroyed a Beis Hamikdash without realizing what they destroyed. Whereas with regards to the Jewish people, is kvasim connected Yisroveim kavuim. The sheep represent the Jewish people who are stable. Which means not only do the Jewish people last through the course of history, but it means that our karbanos have an eternal impact on the world. How so? Because when we're davening, which is the replacement in our current situation for karbanos, that neutralizes all the 98 curses that were stacked up in Mishnah Torah. Even when the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed and we're in exile, and we're suffering under the hands of belligerent nations. We don't. We're under the hand of belligerent nations. The Rebbe says we don't have to suffer. We could live in absolute serenity and peace. As we see, when the Jewish people were still in Mitzrayim, they had light when everybody else had darkness in Mitzrayim, in the toughest times. That's what we could have. And living with that sense of peace in our world, that opens the door for the truest peace and serenity in the fullest form, from David, even greater than the peace and redemption that David HaMelech experienced, even more than the most peaceful time in Jewish history, under the dominion of Shlomo HaMelech. Navi B'mei HaMoshiach will have the ultimate experience of complete serenity and peace with the coming of Mashiach, with the coming of Mashiach immediately.